All right, guys. So Joe Rogan, arguably the most popular podcast host in the country, just came out and accused Israel of committing a genocide in Gaza, which is obviously something that me and many others have been saying for a long time now. And I don't watch the Joe Rogan podcast on any sort of regular basis, so I don't know exactly what his position has been over the last 6 months. I do know that he got into a wild back and forth with Kid Rock when Kid Rock was basically calling to just completely obliterate everybody in Gaza. So I know that he's at least skeptical of Israel to some extent. But as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that he's used this kind of language. So let's go ahead and jump into this and we'll come out the other side.
I mean, did she show that Edward Snowden video that he put up on Twitter that shows them drone bombing those kids that are those men, I should say unarmed people that were walking towards the rubble that clearly weren't causing any danger to anybody?
Yeah,
they just bombed them.
Yeah, no, it's your duty. It's just like for Biden or whoever you like, you're supposed to cover up for them because
the whole thing is like they're always saying they're only targeting Hamas and everybody else is a casualty. Well, if those guys are just unarmed civilians and they're walking alone, that's what they appear to be.
Dresden.
And you just blast them from the sky with robots.
This is the tragedy of war.
Yeah, this is insane. And no one knows what to think now because if you can't talk about that, if you can't say that's real, then you're saying that genocide is okay as long as we're doing it. And
that is what we're saying.
And if you're saying that from a perspective of someone who literally went through the Holocaust or your people, your tribe, went through the fucking Holocaust and now you're willing to do it?
I hope the irony's not lost on you.
It's so nuts. It's so hard to imagine that someone where a culture, like a country was like officially founded in, what, 47?
48.
48? Okay. Officially founded. So that's so recent. and you guys are willing to do what was done to you that led you to believe that you needed to start your own country? You're willing to do that at least on a small scale in Gaza. Like there's nothing left. If you see the videos, let's see some recent footage of Gaza because have they stopped bombing? I know people are calling for ceasefires. Well, you know what I think is going to help? In San Francisco, the city council all got together with masks on, and they voted on a ceasefire. And then they all danced. Yes, they won. The ceasefire passed. The ceasefire passed, which is really important. And when it passed, they were all these fucking freaks with blue hair were all dancing around with masks on. Please show that, because it's one of the most wonderful things on the internet.
Okay. So, I mean, that end bit there where he's talking about, like, you know, woke, blue-haired, you know, COVID mask wearing people and making fun of them. I mean, this is kind of why I, and I think many others, just, like, got bored of a lot of what Joe Rogan has to say. He just gets very fixated on the anti-woke stuff and just can't get over COVID and so many other things like that. But whatever, we can put that aside for now. When he's talking about the mass bombing of Gaza, right? And even this other guy that's on the podcast, I don't know who this guy is, Kurt Metzger or whatever, he throws out the word Dresden, right? I've covered on this channel, we've seen the comparisons to the proportionate destruction that the Allied forces did in Dresden during World War II, and what Israel has done in just a short time period, 6 months or less, inside of Gaza, on a much more densely populated place, has already outstripped the Allied bombing of Dresden, which is widely known historically as one of the most intense bombing campaigns of you know, civilian infrastructure in history, right? We've seen other comparisons to Aleppo and to Mariupol in Ukraine, right? And Mosul during battles with ISIS. Every modern comparison to, you know, widespread destruction of infrastructure is basically incomparable to what Israel has done inside of Gaza. And of course, the bombing is still continuing, right? Even though there have been calls and protests for ceasefire for months and months and months at this point. The UN at the Security Council just recently passed a ceasefire resolution, and they were only able to do this because after vetoing 3 other ceasefire resolutions, the United States chose to abstain on this one. And then quickly after that, you know, we get a little bit of good news from the UN calling for an immediate ceasefire, and then like a day later, we have all of these US State Department officials and spokesmen like John Kirby and Matthew Miller. They come out, they throw cold water on it, and they say this doesn't change anything about our policy. Israel has a right to continue the war and all of this and that. So we've seen these calls for a ceasefire basically like since the bombing began on October 7th or October 8th, right? And so, you know, when he references this being a genocide, it's not just some random word that has some abstract meaning. When we use the word genocide, at least when I use it, I don't know how he views it, but when I use the word genocide, I'm talking about the actual definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention and international law, right? Now, you can go and read through the entire South Africa International Court of Justice case. They lay it out very explicitly, okay? And it's not as if Israel has eased up since the ICJ came down and said that Israel is plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza. If anything, they've ramped it up. I mean, we're talking about not only a majority of the standing structures, the housing in Gaza that has been destroyed. We're talking about attacks on the majority of farmland and water and restrictions on aid that are now leading to a mass famine. We're talking about 10 children a day that are being forced to have amputations without anesthesia because Israel won't allow in adequate medical supplies, as well as continuing to attack hospitals inside of Gaza, to the point now where like 31 out of 36 hospitals in Gaza are no longer operable. And some of the ones that are still barely functioning, Israel continues to attack and to do raids inside of, like Al-Shifa Hospital, which they are still attacking right now, okay? And then you combine that with the just core statistics of how many people have been killed, how many people have been injured, how many people have been internally displaced and forced into mass refugee camps like Rafah, where Israel is now planning their next upcoming invasion. I mean, all of this adds up to something that is as clear as you could possibly ask for, right? And the drone footage that he was referencing there towards the top of that clip, where you see these 4 teenagers who are walking down. I mean, first of all, look at the rubble that's surrounding them in this clip. I mean, it is nothing but just pure destruction. You can look at maps if you want to. Go Google, maps comparing what Gaza looked like before the bombing versus what it looks like now. I mean, I'm talking about just as far as the eye can see. You can go up with a drone, and as far as you can possibly get that camera to look, buildings are flattened to the ground. This is what it looks like in a huge portion of Gaza. There's barely anything left. And so you see these 4 guys, they're walking through the rubble, and then, I showed this in my video yesterday, I believe, and then they're bombed by this drone, right? They were posing no threat, they didn't have weapons on them, just walking down a completely empty street, and a drone from above snipes them from the sky and hits them with 2 different rockets in this instance. And then it wasn't even just that, okay? If this wasn't bad enough, you fast forward through the clip, one of them is then trying to walk away from the other corpses, and then they solo in on him, okay? And then they blow him up. So then you have another one. And then you had a third one where this guy, clearly disoriented and injured in some way, and he's literally crawling on his hands and knees, and then he gets blown up. 3 separate strikes that we're talking about here. So there's no excuse for this. There's no, they may have been Hamas, or Hamas was hiding under the building that we just blew up, or something like that. There's no excuse. And so I think that plays into why this clip specifically went so mega viral and had such a lasting impact with people, is because it was as clear as day. There's not even a pretense to pretend as if this was a legitimate strike, right? Now, if you've been following this closely since October 7th, like I have and many others have, I've seen videos that are significantly worse than this. You might look at that video and say, how could it possibly be worse? I've seen videos that are significantly worse than this, okay, on a very regular basis. But again, you always have this obfuscation. You have, you'll see a pancaked building to the ground with children's limbs sticking out the side of it. And then you'll have Israel, they come in and they try to, water it down, and they say, but there was a Hamas battalion that was hiding in the basement or something like that. And so then, everybody kind of moves on or whatever. But this one, for some reason, really stuck in people's minds to the point where even Joe Rogan, it came across his feed or whatever, and he ended up seeing it. And it's completely inexcusable. Now, in terms of the genocide term, again, we mean something very specific by this. And we even just had, this came out yesterday, the special rapporteur, Frances Albanese, I believe is how you pronounce her name, at the United Nations Human Rights Council. She came out and basically said from her report that it's likely that Israel is engaging in a genocide in Gaza. So let's watch a little bit of what she had to say as part of this announcement, and then we'll read a little bit more into it.
Following nearly 6 months.
Sorry, I'll take that off ×2 speed.
Of unrelenting Israeli assault on occupied Gaza, it is my solemn duty to report on the worst of what humanity is capable of and to present my finding, the anatomy of a genocide. One of my key findings is that Israel's executive and military leadership and soldiers have intentionally distorted rules of international humanitarian law, distinction, proportionality, and precaution in an attempt to legitimize genocidal violence against the Palestinian people by deliberately stretching the definitions of human shield, evacuation orders, warnings, safe zones, collateral damage, and medical protection. Israel has used their protective function as humanitarian camouflage, with the effect of concealing patterns of conduct from which the only inference can reasonably be drawn is a state policy of genocidal violence against the Palestinians. In light of this, I find that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide against Palestinians as a group in Gaza has been met. Specifically, Israel has committed 3 acts of genocide with the requisite intent: causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group.
Okay, so there was her announcement there. Again, when you look at the breakdown of exactly what we're talking about when we use the word genocide, it's a pretty clear definition, right? There's a lot of nuance and complexities or whatever when you're getting into the actual, legal case, like at the ICJ. It's an incredibly complicated case and process that has to play out. It may take months or even years for that entire case to get to its conclusion. But the definition is actually not that complicated. And if you break it down point by point, Israel, I think, not plausibly, but definitively, is guilty of at least 3, as she was just pointing out there, or arguably more, of the violations against the Genocide Convention. And some of this, like in the ICJ case that South Africa brought, you don't even have to look at like just the evidence on the ground, because one of the most difficult parts of genocide to prove under international law is the aspect of intent. And what South Africa did is they basically just listed out a bunch of the most powerful people in Israel: Netanyahu, the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and the Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, and then the Minister of Agriculture, and all of these other things. High-ranking government officials, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and soldiers on the ground, all of that, and just they quoted them. That's what it takes, because they are not even really trying to hide it. They're openly genocidal with the rhetoric that they are using, and also obviously their tactics. So she tended to focus more so on the tactics, it looks like here. And so from Al Jazeera, they expand on it. They say, entitled "The Anatomy of Genocide," the report listed the violating acts as killing members of the group, checkmark, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group's members, checkmark, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Again, checkmark. We're talking about like half the population of Gaza that has been stuffed into a massive refugee camp in the southern tip of Gaza, in Rafah, which used to have, before October 7th, a population of like 300,000 people, now has over 1.2 million people stuffed inside of it. And Israel is talking about going and doing a ground invasion there, as people are sleeping out in tents, okay? And there's the prospect of disease spreading. There is, again, people who are starving to death at this point. And they're talking about ramping up their offensive. They're worsening the humanitarian catastrophe that is already underway, a man-made catastrophe that has been weaponized as an intentional part of Israel's war on the people of Gaza. And so, we see these statements from high-ranking Israeli officials talking about, well, why don't they just go into the desert? Why don't they just go into the Sinai Peninsula? Why don't other surrounding countries just take all of these people so we can do whatever we want inside of Gaza? I mean, yeah, it's hard to look at what they're doing on the ground, to look at the scale and the speed of the destruction and death, and to not believe that this is anything calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I mean, it obviously falls under this purview, but they continue here. They say, Albanese noted that Israel has killed more than 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza since October 7th, and a further 12,000 are reported missing, presumed dead under the rubble. So almost 42,000 at this point, and that may even also be an undercount. It's incredibly difficult to get a real count out of Gaza in terms of casualties, because Israel's offensive is making it impossible. Again, usually the Gaza Ministry of Health will be able to rely on the hospital system to report how many people are coming in with injuries, how many people are dying and being buried and sent to the morgue and whatever. They have a process for that, and it's been incredibly reliable historically. But when you just completely obliterate the hospital system in Gaza, and you're attacking civilian workers and civilians themselves left and right. I saw a video earlier today of somebody who was filming a portion of the north of Gaza, right, which has been under the most intense portion of the siege and the bombing, and that's where the famine is most concentrated. But people were walking around and taking videos where you can see completely decomposed bodies, just skeletons that are just like laying in fields, okay? Because nobody even got the chance to record that person's death, or to, let alone to give them a proper burial, okay? And so when you're looking at stuff like that, yeah, this number is probably significantly higher than what, the 30,000 or even 42,000 indicates here. And she also points out that more than 70% of the recorded deaths have been women and children, not just civilians, women and children. And Israel has failed to prove that the remaining 30% adult males were active Hamas fighters, okay, which obviously no reasonable person would ever believe. Oh, so 70% of the people you've killed have been innocent women and children, but we're supposed to believe that 100% of the rest of them are all Hamas fighters. You haven't killed a single innocent, adult male inside of Gaza. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. So when you take the real number, I mean, if 70% are women and children, then we're talking about what? Over 90% in all likelihood have been civilians, if you include the adult males in that number. So it's kind of hard to believe that this is some sort of a targeted operation against Hamas when you're killing upwards of like 90% civilians. This is not normal, guys. This does not usually happen even in some of the more brutal wars that we have seen throughout recent history. They say, regarding the second violated act, Albanese said that Israeli forces have wounded more than 70,000 Palestinians. Again, that's probably an undercount. And they've also detained thousands of Palestinian men and boys, subjecting them to torture and to mistreatment. Okay? And think about also the amount of trauma. The entire population of Gaza has been traumatized. I mean, we're talking about a place where half the population is children. Think about the kind of conditions that they are growing up with, this kind of terrorism that they are being subjected to. I read a horrible story the other day from a mother who was describing what it's like in Gaza right now, and she described how her 8-year-old little girl, her 8-year-old child, was on a daily basis wishing for death because of how traumatized, because of how horrific the day-to-day experience was. I mean, imagine that. Imagine your own child wishing to die because life is so unbearable. I mean, it's hard to even wrap your head around. She continues saying, on the third act, Albanese has said that Israel has destroyed or severely damaged most of Gaza's life-sustaining infrastructure, including hospitals and agricultural land. Okay, again, destroyed a majority of the functioning hospital system. They've destroyed a majority of the agriculture, attacked many different, water supplies that Gaza would have had at their disposal. And this is as they are actively blocking aid from getting in. So you're destroying their agriculture, their ability to get food for themselves. You're destroying their water systems. And then you're also restricting aid from getting in. Yeah, of course that's going to lead to a famine, right? Even to the point they're restricting aid so much that their closest ally, the United States of America, is about to go build a fucking port off the coast of Gaza to try to circumnavigate around the Israeli blockade. Instead of just applying pressure on Israel to lift the blockade and allow aid into Gaza, we're building a fucking port that isn't even going to be done, let alone be able to deliver enough aid in before there's a mass famine. We're dropping aid from the sky in these airdrops. I covered a couple weeks ago, there was one of these airdrops that fell because they're falling from the sky at like fucking 20, 30 miles an hour, and they're these giant containers, and it killed 5 people in one of the airdrops. Another story just came yesterday. 12 additional people died because some of the parachutes on these airdrops malfunctioned, and the aid ended up falling in the ocean, and people were so desperate to get to the food that they swam out into the waters, and 12 people drowned to death. I mean, we're doing this. We're dropping aid from the sky and building a fucking port because we don't want to upset or offend the Israeli government, as we are actively giving them weapons, giving them money, giving them diplomatic cover in order to continue the genocide. They say additionally, calls for violent annihilation from Israeli high-ranking officials aimed at soldiers on duty on the ground serve as compelling evidence of explicit and public encouragement to commit genocide. And I'm just going to link this down below. I won't go through the entire thing, but this was a thread of some of the many different self-published war crimes that the IDF soldiers have been doing over the last 6 months. I mean, again, it's like, you don't even have to look for like some leaked military footage or documents to expose a war crime, because IDF soldiers are just posting them on TikTok. They're just posting them on Facebook and Instagram, bragging about them. Some of them, are posting like on their Tinder profiles on dating apps. And it'll be like a picture of them with some like women's lingerie that they just stole from a family they killed, okay, hanging on the wall behind them. I mean, it's just, it's so disgusting. It's so beyond disgusting. But there's a thread if you want to go look at some examples of some of these soldiers admitting to that. And I'll finish off with this. They say, of course, Israel's denying all of this. Oh, it's outrageous. Israel's diplomatic mission in Geneva said that the country utterly rejects the report. Of course you do. Describing it as simply an extension of a campaign seeking to undermine the very establishment of the Jewish state. Okay? So, I mean, listen, the only country that is delegitimizing Israel as an entity, as a state, is Israel. You don't get to just go around massacring civilians with complete impunity and expect nobody's going to have any criticism. And then when they do criticize you, you turn around and you say, this is anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism. It's utterly ridiculous. Nobody's buying this at this point. Nobody's buying this at this point unless you're like either not aware of what's actually happening or you're just completely beholden to whatever Israel wants to do. I mean, simply an extension of a campaign seeking to undermine the establishment of the Jewish state. They say Israel's war is against Hamas, not against Palestinian civilians, in a statement slamming these outrageous accusations from the UN. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe that this is a war against Hamas and not Palestinian civilians when a vast majority of the people who you're killing are civilians, right? Kind of hard to buy that when you're destroying civilian homes and, university buildings with controlled demolitions, and you're attacking hospitals and all sorts of different civilian infrastructure, and then massacring 90% civilians. Kind of hard to believe that it's just a war against Hamas. So we would never want to hurt the Palestinian civilians. I mean, it's just fucking bullshit, right? And again, I mean, it's an outrageous accusation. I mean, just come on, man. What are we doing? A U.S. official, of course, told the AFP that Washington is aware of the report, but has no reason to believe that Israel has committed acts of genocide in Gaza. This is the same U.S. government that when South Africa brought their case at the ICJ, came out and said that it was, it was meritless and counterproductive and all of that stuff, right? The U.S. insisted on Monday that it had no evidence that Israel has violated human rights and that its ally has offered assurances that it has not used the weapons it's donating to violate international humanitarian law. I mean, I covered this on the channel yesterday. What do you even say at this point? I mean, it's just sick. It's absolutely disgusting. It's hard for me to describe in real time. I mean, all I can say, I guess, is that when history looks back on this moment, right, there's a reason why people have the nickname Genocide Joe right now. That's what he'll be known as. This is how history will look back at this moment. It really is one of those historic moments where people 20, 30 years from now are going to look back and say, how the fuck did you guys let that happen? How were people just standing around doing nothing while this was going on? And the U.S. government, even as the UN is coming out with these reports, every major human rights organization coming out with these reports, the ICJ says that a genocide is plausible, they just brush it all aside. And not only do they brush aside the accusation of genocide, but they're putting out like State Department reports that are basically just saying, don't worry guys, Israel gave us the pinky promise behind the scenes that they're not doing war crimes. And then they're just like, yeah, we accept that at face value. We're going to continue giving you weapons, right? Because guess what? If they are in violation of international law, which they are, and if they are blockading aid from getting into Gaza, which they are, then it's not only against international law, in terms of the U.S. being complicit in this genocide, it's also against U.S. domestic law, under like the Leahy Law and the Foreign Assistance Act, for the United States to be sending weapons to Israel. So of course they have to come out and just pretend, no, they're not committing any war crimes with this, so that they can continue to send those weapons. And finishing off here, Ryan Grimm, he posted this polling here showing that some of the impact that this video here had, as well as the Flower massacre that I covered a couple weeks ago, where Israel just massacred a bunch of Palestinians who were desperately trying to get to some of the aid trucks. And he says, after the Flower massacre, Democratic voters now disapprove of Israeli military action by 75 to 18 margin, while the Democratic president continues arming Israel to the teeth. So Democratic voters disapprove of the Israeli military actions by 75% to 18%. And yet, the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party, obviously Republicans included in that, but even the overwhelming majority of Democrats and Joe Biden himself are continuing to send them weapons and continuing to give them cover to continue with the genocide. I mean, it's a lovely democracy that we have going on here, where you can have a vast majority of the American people, a vast majority of even a political party that is on one side of an issue, very clearly, demonstrably, and yet there's no correlation. There's no correlation between what the American people want and what the U.S. government does. There's no correlation. There's certainly a correlation between what, corporate America wants, what the billionaire class wants, and then what gets passed in terms of legislation. But for average people, I mean, you can literally go to every single Biden event that he ever does, confront him with protests, stand outside of the White House all day, call your members of Congress, do everything that you possibly can, and it won't shift. It won't shift. I mean, he's definitely feeling the pressure. This is certainly something that could cost him the 2024 election, but you're 6 months into this, man, and you really have not done jack shit to change anything, to even rein Israel in, really. So what are we supposed to take away from that? Other than you do not give a single solitary shit what the American people feel, what even your own party feels about this, and you're going to potentially, risk the United States plunging into this Trump fascist dictator takeover, which is how Democrats talk about it, but you're willing to risk that happening in order to do what? To support Israel committing a genocide in Gaza. I mean, all of this is just a sick joke, man.